Let's turn our attention to international news now. The Trump administration has signalled strongly that it simply will not tolerate chemical attacks by the Syrian regime, but it is yet to articulate its policy towards Syria or Russia or its campaign to eradicate ISIS. Linda Robinson is a senior international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. Her current research centres on the US strategy to counter the Islamic State, grey zone conflicts, building partner capacity and special operation forces. She recently testified before the US Congress on US counter-terrorism policy and has recently returned to the US from a trip in Syria. Linda joins me. Good morning and thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be with you.
You've travelled to Syria. What is your take on the latest developments?
I had the chance to visit northern Syria both at the end of February and again at the end of March. And particularly in the areas around Manbij and Al-Bab, there is a quite close proximity of the various armed forces. Of course, Russia has been supplying primarily overhead air power to the regime as it seeks to fight off the Syrian regime, as it seeks to fight off its various opponents. The U.S. Special Operations Forces have been partnered with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and then there are Turkish-supported opposition forces that also have some U.S. support. So you have these three lines converging in these areas, and they are quite close to each other. And that is what I signaled in some of my commentary since I've returned as posing a grave risk of fighting or unintended clashes among these forces that could potentially draw the U.S. and Russia into some direct conflict.
So finally we have the US. It's has finally signalled that it will simply not tolerate chemical attacks by Assad against his own people. But at the moment, despite the latest bombing of the Syrian airport, it still doesn't get rid of the man. So what now?
That's right. And I would say it's really quite a long distance between a strike against a regime-held airfield in Syria and Assad's departure, because, of course, the trajectory of this conflict has been that Russia's involvement has greatly strengthened Assad's hand and his control of the western part of the country over this past year plus since Russia entered the war in September 30th a year ago, September. So we have now, though, crossed the Rubicon, which is the first U.S. government direct strike on the Assad regime because of its chemical weapons use. As you just alluded to, the Obama administration backed down from that after having declared it a red line. What is still unclear is how much farther the Trump administration may go. I think it has established a precedent, certainly, that if there are further chemical weapon attacks, it will be in a position where it's quite likely to have to respond and perhaps even respond in an escalated manner. But it's unclear whether this means it would take further steps to neutralize the air assets that have been so critical for the Assad's regime reclaiming control of its western half of the country.
I just don't understand what is in it for Assad to gas his own people when you have the international community condemnation and other Middle Eastern observers say it is simply a desperate move for power at all costs, and that's something perhaps we in Western societies will always fail to understand because it's just so incredibly cruel, Linda. Is it as simple as that?
Yes. I think it's very important to look at this not through the Western lens, as you just mentioned, but to look at it through Assad's own lens. And remember, he is the son of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who conducted some extraordinarily brutal campaigns in his day. I think there's actually quite a grim and cold logic to this. activity that's being undertaken. Assad wants literally to terrorize the population. It's quite incredible to me, actually, that this opposition has remained in force all of these years despite a really bloody and brutal campaign. And I think that what he is trying to signal at this stage with this attack is that the people should have no hope. He's progressively taken over cities, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and now he's moving in, I think, to prepare a bloody campaign in the Idlib province, where the bulk of the remaining opposition is. So I think that it really does bring to a fine point the question of what the Trump administration intends to do about Syria, meaning the Syrian civil war. And I think what is really incumbent upon this relatively new administration is to think in terms of all of the interlocking parts of this conflict. It must have a Russia strategy. It must have a Syria policy. And both of those have to be nested with its approach to the ISIS campaign. The Obama administration really tried to carve these things apart and say, we're going after ISIS, that's what we care about, and the other issues kind of fell by the wayside.
Linda, in your view, it has been suggested the reason why Putin supports the Assad regime is simply because he wants to be seen by his own people as having strength and power. And this is the only true ally for whatever reason he seems to have, so he looks good. Is it as simple as that?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. One is a geopolitical issue, which is Russia is trying to expand its influence around the world, and Syria is an important and indeed pretty much the only firm foothold it has in terms of an ally in the Middle East. It is trying to do so in court favor and be involved in Libya, in Egypt, in other areas. But this is, I think, a geopolitical move to say Russia has influence in the Middle East. It's also a very discrete, concrete military issue in that he has now bases. Putin has bases now in Syria. There's the Tartus base on the Mediterranean, and that has been there for quite a many years, but there are the chances now to upgrade that. And of course, he now has assets in airfields and lots of advisors. But it can be portrayed really as a long-term loss for him if you look at the fact that the Assad regime has no ground force. It's heavily dependent on Iranian advisors, Iranian-sponsored militias, Lebanese Hezbollah. The Syrian military itself is hugely degraded. Indeed, most of it went to join the Free Syria Army and formed the bulk of the opposition. So it is now down to estimates vary, but say 20, 30,000 troops. And so it has, I think, scant prospect of really maintaining long-term control over the country, even if they're using these terroristic means to really quash the morale of the opposition.
You've got the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who held a press conference in Moscow alongside the Russian Foreign Minister, and it was quite bizarre, his words suggesting that the US and Russian relations have hit a low point, and he stressed the need to improve ties. And I quote, "There is now a low level of trust between our two countries. The world's two foremost nuclear powers cannot have this kind of relationship." What do you make of those comments?
I think with these statements about Russian and U.S. differences are frankly fairly helpful in that they clarify the fact that, in fact, the U.S. and Russia are on opposite sides in the Syrian conflict. I would also say, despite many people's hope that Russia and the U.S. can form a counterterrorism partnership when Russia countenances a chemical weapons attack by its ally Syria, I think there was a lot of fuzzy, hazy, and probably wrong-headed talk about a U.S.-Russia partnership. And I think that the Obama administration avoided a lot of these tough issues because they didn't want to have to deal with the consequences of Russian actions and the fact that it probably, for any diplomatic endeavor to prosper, you have to be willing to put your money and your weight and indeed your force, if necessary, behind your words.
What I find interesting is that you've got the Russian foreign minister and, of course, you've got the US administration both saying their main goal is to get rid of ISIS. Do you truly believe that's what Russia is trying to do by, in a odd way, support Assad? Or do you think there's more to it than that?
I think there is concrete evidence suggesting that is not the primary goal of Russia or Assad. Their attacks have been squarely focused against the opposition aimed at the regime and not ISIS. The question, and of course what Russia intends, I believe, is to strengthen the Assad regime so that it can wrest control of the country from all groups. So eventually it might turn against ISIS. It certainly did in the Palmyra and Tadmor area. But really the campaign has been heavily focused with Russian firepower and the Assad regime's means against the opposition. I think that there is, on the part of the U.S., a desire to finish the campaign, or at least prioritize the campaign against ISIS and move on to Raqqa and get Raqqa cleared. That doesn't mean you won't have long-term insurgencies in Syria and probably Iraq as well, unless the Iraq government's willing to take some concrete political measures. I think, though, that what we have is Russia's been on one track and the U.S. has been on another. And I think some people have suggested, they framed the problem as follows. What can the U.S. do to gain Russian cooperation? And I think really that's a wrong-headed way to approach it. And I think what Tillerson is trying to do is lay out these stark differences and then say, Russia, what are you prepared to do to get on the same page with us? So I think there's a fundamental reordering of the conversation that is coming about.
At least they are communicating like adults, which is something, I guess. Linda Robinson, Senior International and Defence Researcher at RAND Corporation. Great to have your insight this morning. Thank you very much for your time.